There are two words no fighter ever wants to hear. He dies. A 430-pound giant has Bruce Lee's closest training partner locked in a chokehold, feet dangling off the floor, face turning blue. The giant grins at Bruce. If you move, your friend dies. Bruce stands 8 feet away, still, silent, but behind those eyes a clock has already started. 8 seconds. That's all this monster has left, and he doesn't even know it yet. Let me take you back before that moment, before the chokehold, before the threat, before those 8 seconds that would become one of the most talked about episodes in martial arts history. Because if you don't understand what led to that room, you won't understand what happened inside it. It was early 1968. Los Angeles. Bruce Lee was 27 years old and operating out of a small private training space in Chinatown. Not a public gym, not a commercial dojo. A back room behind a grocery warehouse where the ceiling was low and the floor was concrete covered with old mats. He trained a handful of students there, hand-picked, never more than 10 at a time. This was before Hollywood fully knew his name. Before the Green Hornet made him a household face across America. He was known in martial arts circles, respected by fighters, feared by anyone who had ever stood across from him. But to the rest of the world, he was still nobody. And that mattered because in 1968, being a Chinese martial artist in Los Angeles meant something very specific. It meant people tested you, constantly, not out of respect, out of disbelief. The idea that a man who weighed 140 pounds could defeat anyone who walked through his door was something most people refused to accept, especially men who had size on their side. And Los Angeles, in the late 60s, had no shortage of big men looking to make a name by dismantling someone else's reputation. Wrestlers, boxers, street fighters, bouncers from Sunset Boulevard clubs who had never lost a fight in their lives. They would hear rumors about this Chinese instructor who claimed he could beat anyone regardless of size, and they would show up unannounced, looking for proof that it was all talk. Most of these challenges came and went quickly. Bruce handled them with the kind of clinical efficiency that left witnesses speechless. A lock here, a strike there, 30 seconds, and it was finished. The men would leave with bruised bodies and quiet mouths, and Bruce would go back to training his students like nothing had happened. But there was one man who did not come and go quickly. His name was Victor. No last name was ever confirmed in the accounts that survived. Some say he was Eastern European, others say he was from somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. What everyone agreed on was his size. Victor stood 6 feet 5 inches tall and weighed over 430 pounds. Not fat, thick, dense. A frame that looked like it had been assembled from concrete and steel cable. His neck was wider than most men's thighs. His hands were so large that when he made a fist, it looked like a cannonball wrapped in skin. Victor was not a martial artist. He was a strongman and an underground wrestler who had spent years in bare-knuckle circuits where rules didn't exist, and fights ended when someone stopped moving. He had never been knocked out. He had never been submitted, and he had heard about Bruce Lee from a promoter who told him there was a small Chinese man in Los Angeles who believed size didn't matter in a fight. Victor found that idea personally offensive. He didn't come to Bruce's training space to learn. He didn't come to watch. He came with one intention, to prove that a man his size could not be stopped by technique, by speed, or by anything a 140-pound man could produce. And he brought something with him that changed everything. He brought leverage, not a weapon. Something worse. He brought a hostage. The day Victor showed up was a Thursday afternoon. Bruce was in the middle of a training session with 3 of his students. One of them was a man named Tommy, a lightweight Filipino fighter who had been with Bruce for almost 2 years. Tommy was fast, technical, dedicated. He was also the smallest person in the room that day, maybe 130 pounds soaking wet. He had sharp instincts, but he was built like a greyhound, lean and narrow, designed for speed, not for absorbing punishment. The door to the training space wasn't locked during sessions. Bruce kept it open because ventilation in that back room was terrible, and the Los Angeles heat turned the place into an oven by midday. So when Victor walked in, there was no barrier, no warning, no buffer zone between the outside world and the men on the mats. He just appeared in the doorway like a shadow that blocked out the sun. The room changed the instant he entered. Not because anyone said anything, because of physics. The space felt smaller. The air felt heavier. Every person in that room understood on a primal level that something very large and very dangerous had just walked through the door. Bruce saw him first. He stopped mid-sentence, turned toward the entrance, and measured the man from boots to skull in about half a second. Bruce had seen big men before. He had fought big men before. But witnesses later said that even Bruce paused for a fraction of a moment when he registered Victor's full dimensions. Not fear, assessment, the kind of pause a chess player makes when the board suddenly changes, in a way they did not anticipate. Victor didn't introduce himself. He didn't explain why he was there. He scanned the room slowly like a predator choosing from a herd. His eyes moved past Bruce, past the two larger students standing near the heavy bag, and they landed on Tommy. The smallest one, the one standing closest to the door. What happened next took less than 3 seconds. Victor lunged forward, grabbed Tommy by the throat with one hand, and lifted him completely off the ground. One hand, 430 pounds of force channeled through fingers that wrapped around Tommy's neck like a vice made of flesh and bone. Tommy's feet kicked in the air. His hands clawed at Victor's wrist. His face went from shock to red to a shade of blue that made every person in that room stop breathing. Bruce moved instinctively, one step forward, fast, automatic, the kind of motion that doesn't come from thinking, but from years of training the body to react before the mind catches up. But Victor saw it, and he squeezed harder. Tommy made a sound that wasn't quite a scream and wasn't quite a gasp, something between the two, a sound that human throats make when the airway is almost completely shut. Victor looked directly at Bruce, eye to eye, and he spoke for the first time since entering the room. His voice was calm, almost casual, like a man commenting on the weather. "If you move, your friend dies." The room froze. The two other students pressed themselves against the far wall. Nobody reached for a phone. Nobody ran for help. Everyone understood that the next few seconds would be determined entirely by what Bruce Lee decided to do. Tommy's legs had stopped kicking. His hands were still on Victor's wrist, but the grip was weakening. His eyes were rolling. He was maybe 15 seconds from losing consciousness, and maybe 45 seconds from something much worse. Bruce stood perfectly still, 8 feet from Victor, his weight balanced, his arms loose at his sides, his face showing absolutely nothing. And behind that face, behind those dark, steady eyes, something was happening that Victor could not see and would not understand until it was far too late. Bruce was calculating. Now, I need you to understand something about Bruce Lee that changes how you see this entire moment. Bruce Lee did not think about fighting the way other martial artists did. Most fighters, even great ones, operate on reaction. Something comes at them, they respond. Stimulus and response, action and counteraction. It is fast, it is trained, but it is still fundamentally reactive. Bruce had moved past that years ago. He had spent thousands of hours studying not just how bodies move, but why they move. He understood leverage, anatomy, timing, and the mathematics of human balance in a way that was closer to engineering than combat. When Bruce looked at an opponent, he did not see a man. He saw a structure, a system of joints, weight distribution, pressure points, and vulnerabilities, and every structure, no matter how massive, had a failure point. This is what Bruce was doing in those frozen seconds while Tommy dangled from Victor's grip. He was not panicking, he was not searching for courage. He was reading Victor the way an architect reads a building that is about to be demolished. Where is the load-bearing weakness? Where does the frame give way? What is the single point of failure that brings the entire thing down? And Victor, for all his enormous size, had given Bruce exactly what he needed. He had extended his arm. A 430-pound man with his arm fully stretched out, gripping a target at the end of that extension, is not in a position of strength. He is in a position of exposure. The elbow is locked, the shoulder is committed, the balance is shifted forward onto the front foot to compensate for the weight he is holding away from his body. Every joint in that chain is under load, and a joint under load is a joint that can be broken with far less force than most people imagine. Bruce knew this. He had practiced strikes against extended limbs for years, specifically because bigger opponents almost always reached. They reached because their arms were long and their instinct was to use that length as an advantage. But reach without retraction is a gift to someone who understands where to hit and when. The problem was time. Tommy was fading. His face had gone from blue to something closer to grey. His fingers were barely curled around Victor's wrist anymore. If Bruce waited too long, the calculation wouldn't matter because there would be nothing left to save. And if he moved wrong, if Victor felt the attack coming even a quarter second early, one reflexive squeeze would collapse Tommy's windpipe permanently. So Bruce needed to do two things simultaneously. He needed to break Victor's grip on Tommy's throat, and he needed to do it in a way that gave Victor zero time to react with that grip. Not a full second, not half a second, zero. Most fighters alive could not solve that equation. The distance was 8 feet. The margin for error was non-existent. The target was a specific set of tendons and nerves in a forearm thicker than a fence post. And the entire sequence had to happen faster than a human reflex, faster than the signal from Victor's brain could travel down his arm and tell those fingers to squeeze. That signal takes approximately 1/10 of a second in a normal human body. Bruce needed to cover 8 feet, deliver a strike precise enough to short-circuit the grip, and redirect Tommy's body away from danger in less time than it takes a nerve impulse to travel from elbow to fingertip. Impossible for any normal person. But Bruce Lee had spent his entire adult life making the impossible feel routine. He had already chosen his entry angle. He had already selected the strike. He had already mapped Tommy's full trajectory. Everything was loaded. Everything was ready. All he needed was the opening. And Victor, without realizing it, was about to give him one. Victor made a mistake, a small one, the kind that only matters when you are standing across from someone who has spent a decade turning small mistakes into endings. He shifted his eyes, not away from Bruce, not toward the door. He glanced down at Tommy, just for a heartbeat, a fraction of a second where his visual focus dropped from Bruce's face to the man hanging from his fist. It was instinct, a predator checking on its prey, making sure the animal in his grip was still struggling, still useful as a shield. But, in that fraction of a second, Victor's peripheral awareness of Bruce went soft, not blind, soft. The difference between watching a man and sensing a man. And that gap, that tiny window of degraded attention, was everything Bruce needed. He moved, not forward, not in a straight line. Bruce stepped laterally first, one short explosive step to his left that changed the angle between his body and Victor's extended arm. This is critical to understand. If Bruce had charged straight ahead, Victor would have seen mass approaching in his peripheral vision, and his reflexes would have fired. The squeeze would have come. Tommy would have been gone. But lateral movement is different. The human eye tracks forward motion instinctively. It is wired to detect things coming toward the face. Side-to-side motion, especially quick compact motion at the edge of peripheral vision, registers slower, milliseconds slower. But milliseconds were the entire battlefield here. From the new angle, Bruce was no longer directly in front of Victor. He was offset to the left, aligned with the outside of Victor's extended right arm. And then he closed the distance, not with a lunge, not with a running step, with what witnesses later described as something that didn't look like human locomotion. A burst, a single explosive compression of distance that covered those 8 feet in a time frame none of the students in that room could later agree on. Some said it was instant. Some said they saw a blur. One of them said he blinked and Bruce was simply somewhere else, as if the space between where he had been standing and where he arrived had been deleted from reality. Bruce's first strike hit the inside of Victor's right forearm, not the muscle. The nerve cluster that sits between the radius and ulna, about 3 inches below the elbow. It was not a punch. It was a knuckle strike, 2 knuckles extended, driven with the rotational force of Bruce's entire core behind it. The effect was immediate and involuntary. When that specific nerve cluster is hit with sufficient force, the fingers do not choose to open. They simply open. The brain is not consulted. The hand releases whatever it is holding, the same way a leg kicks when a doctor taps below the kneecap. It is not a decision. It is electricity shorting out. Tommy dropped, not gently. He fell straight down like a puppet whose strings had been cut, but Bruce had already anticipated the fall. His left hand was underneath Tommy's chest before the man's knees hit the ground, redirecting his collapse sideways and away from Victor's reach. Tommy hit the mat on his side, gasping, coughing, alive. Half a second had passed since Bruce left his starting position. Victor's hand was still open. His fingers were still twitching from the nerve disruption. His brain was still processing the fact that the weight he had been holding was suddenly gone. And in that half second of confusion, of empty fingers and a mind trying to catch up to what had just happened, Bruce Lee was already inside Victor's guard, directly in front of his chest, close enough to smell him, close enough to hear his heartbeat. And what came next did not take 8 seconds, because 8 seconds was the total. The clock had already started, and it was about to run out. Bruce did not hit Victor the way most fighters hit a larger opponent. Most fighters facing a man that size aim for the head. They go for the knockout, the dramatic finish, the clean shot to the jaw that drops the giant and ends the fairy tale the way audiences expect. But Bruce understood something about men who weigh over 400 pounds that made the head a poor first target. Mass absorbs impact. A skull sitting on top of a neck thicker than a telephone pole, supported by traps and shoulders built from decades of lifting and grappling, can take punishment that would flatten a normal man. Hitting Victor in the jaw would have been like punching a boulder and expecting it to flinch. The force would scatter across all that mass and accomplish nothing except letting Victor know he was in a fight. And the last thing Bruce wanted was Victor in fight mode. Right now, Victor was confused. His hand was empty. His brain was lagging. He was a giant machine that had just experienced a malfunction and had not yet rebooted. Bruce needed to finish this before the reboot completed. He went low. His first real offensive strike after freeing Tommy was a kick to the inside of Victor's left knee. Not a sweeping kick, a direct linear kick with the heel, driven at a downward angle into the soft tissue on the inner side of the joint. The knee is a hinge. It is designed to bend in one direction. Force applied laterally, especially from the inside, attacks the medial collateral ligament, a band of tissue that holds the entire joint together and cannot be strengthened through any amount of weightlifting or conditioning. Size does not protect the knee. 430 pounds actually makes it worse because all that mass is depending on that joint to stay upright. When Bruce's heel connected, Victor's left leg buckled inward. Not completely. He did not go down. But he staggered. His base widened as his body instinctively tried to redistribute weight to the right leg. And for one critical moment his torso dropped about 6 inches as the damaged knee partially gave way. That drop brought Victor's centerline into Bruce's range, the solar plexus, a dense bundle of nerves sitting behind the stomach wall, just below the sternum. On most men, it is protected by the rib cage above and abdominal muscle in front. But when the body drops suddenly, when the torso pitches forward because a leg has buckled, the abdomen stretches and the muscles there go momentarily slack. It is a window that lasts maybe half a second. Bruce drove a straight punch into that window with everything he had. Not a jab, not a probing shot, a fully committed strike with his entire body weight rotating behind the fist. The impact was something the students in that room later said they felt in their own chests. Not heard, felt, like a pressure change in the air. Victor folded, his mouth opened but no sound came out. When the solar plexus takes a clean shot, the diaphragm spasms. The lungs lock. The body forgets how to breathe. It is one of the most disabling sensations a human being can experience, and no amount of size or toughness provides immunity. Victor's upper body pitched forward as his nervous system overloaded. His hands went to his stomach. His chin dropped toward his chest. And that is when Bruce delivered the final strike. An elbow, rising, compact, traveling maybe 8 inches from chamber to contact. It caught Victor directly under the chin as his head came down. The force snapped his jaw shut and sent a shockwave through his skull that shut off consciousness like a breaker switch being thrown in a dark building. Victor went backward. All 430 pounds. His body hit the concrete floor with a sound that shook the heavy bag off its chain. The room was completely silent. The kind of silence that doesn't come from the absence of sound, but from the presence of something that has overwhelmed the brain's ability to process what just happened. Victor was on his back, motionless, his chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. His jaw was already swelling. His left leg was bent at an angle that suggested the knee had taken more damage than it initially appeared. He was alive, but he was not getting up. Not in the next few minutes. Probably not without help. Bruce stood over him for a moment. His breathing was controlled, barely elevated, as if what had just happened required the same physical effort as walking across a parking lot. The two students pressed against the far wall had not moved. Their eyes were wide and their mouths were open, and neither of them would speak for several minutes. Tommy was on the mat, sitting up now, one hand on his throat, coughing in short, ragged bursts. His neck was already showing bruises in the shape of fingers, deep purple marks that would take weeks to fade. But he was breathing. He was conscious. He was alive, and he knew exactly how close he had come to not being any of those things. Bruce turned away from Victor and walked to Tommy. He knelt down beside him. He did not ask if Tommy was okay, because he could see that Tommy was not okay. Instead, he placed one hand on the back of Tommy's neck gently, felt the swelling around the throat and checked his pupils. Methodical, calm. The same precision he had used to dismantle Victor seconds ago was now being used to assess his friend's injuries. He told one of the students to bring water. He told the other to open the back door for air. His voice was steady and quiet, the voice of a man who had already moved past what happened and was focused entirely on what needed to happen next. Tommy tried to speak. His voice came out as a whisper, broken and rough, squeezed through a throat that was still partially swollen shut. He said 2 words. "Thank you." Bruce shook his head, not dismissively, the way a man shakes his head when words are unnecessary, because what exists between two people in that moment goes beyond language. He helped Tommy to his feet slowly, let him lean against the wall, and handed him the water when it arrived. Then Bruce walked back to the center of the room and looked down at Victor. The giant had not moved. His eyes were open now, half open, unfocused, staring at the ceiling with the glazed confusion of a man whose brain was still trying to reconnect with his body. Bruce crouched beside him, not with aggression, not with triumph, with the same calm, measured energy he brought to everything. He spoke to Victor quietly, low enough that the students near the wall could not hear the words. What Bruce said in that moment was never fully confirmed. Tommy, who was closest, later told others that he caught fragments, something about choices, something about the difference between strength and cruelty, something about what happens to men who use innocent people as tools for their own ego. But the exact words remained between Bruce and the man on the floor. What everyone in that room did hear was what Bruce said when he stood up. He said it loud enough for all of them. "Get him out of my school and make sure he remembers why he's leaving." The 2 students carried Victor out through the back door. It took both of them, and even then they struggled with the weight. They left him sitting against the wall in the alley behind the warehouse, conscious enough to eventually stand, damaged enough to never forget. But this story does not end in that room, because what happened that afternoon set something in motion that Bruce did not anticipate. Word travelled, not through newspapers, not through television, through the only network that mattered in the martial arts underground of 1960s Los Angeles. Mouth to mouth, fighter to fighter, gym to gym. The story mutated slightly with each retelling the way all stories do. The details shifted. Victor's weight grew by 10 pounds in some versions, 20 in others. The number of seconds shrank from 8 to 5 in a few retellings, but the core of the story never changed. A giant had threatened to kill a man. Bruce Lee had freed the hostage and dismantled the giant in less time than it takes to tie a shoe. And he had done it without rage, without panic, without a single wasted movement. Challengers stopped showing up, not immediately. There were a few more over the following months, men who hadn't heard the story or didn't believe it. They came, they left. The results were always the same, but the frequency dropped. The stream of oversized, tough guys looking to test Bruce Lee against their bulk slowed to a trickle and then dried up entirely. Not because Bruce advertised what he had done. He never spoke about the Victor incident publicly. Not once. He didn't use it to promote himself or his school or his philosophy. It simply existed in the ecosystem of fighters and trainers and students as a fact. A piece of evidence that answered the question people had been asking since Bruce first started teaching. Can a small man truly defeat a much larger one? The answer was on the floor of that back room in Chinatown, unconscious and swelling. But here is what mattered more than the fight itself. Here is the part that separates this story from every other Bruce Lee legend you have ever heard. It was not the victory that defined that afternoon. It was the reason for it. Bruce did not fight Victor to prove a theory. He did not fight to protect his reputation. He did not fight because his ego demanded it. He fought because a man he cared about was dying in front of him, and the only path between his friend and death was through 430 pounds of hostile muscle. That is a distinction most people miss when they talk about Bruce Lee. They focus on the speed, they focus on the technique, they marvel at the physics of what his body could produce. And all of that deserves admiration. But the engine behind all of it, the thing that made Bruce Lee move in that fraction of a second when any other man would have frozen, was not skill, it was loyalty. The absolute unshakable refusal to let someone he loved be destroyed while he stood and watched. Tommy trained with Bruce for another 4 years after that day. He never spoke about the incident casually. When people asked him about it, and many did, he would go quiet for a moment. Then he would say something that captured more about Bruce Lee than any biography ever written. He would say Bruce didn't save my life that day. He decided my life was worth saving, and then he made sure the universe agreed. Tommy would pause after saying that, and then he would add one more thing. You know what scares me? It's not that Victor could have killed me, it's that Bruce solved the whole thing in 8 seconds. That means he knew exactly what to do the moment it started. He wasn't figuring it out, he already knew. He was just waiting for the right fraction of a second to move. That is what Bruce Lee was. Not a fighter, not a showman. A man who had already solved the problem before the problem knew it existed. And on that Thursday afternoon in a back room in Los Angeles, a 430-pound giant learned that lesson the hard way. 8 seconds. That is all it took. Not because Bruce Lee was fast, because he was ready. He had always been ready.